On a morning in the autumn of 1973, a man named Karl František Koecher drove south along the George Washington Memorial Parkway in Virginia, turned at the access road marked by federal signage, passed through a security checkpoint, and received his first contractor's identification badge for the headquarters compound of the Central Intelligence Agency in Langley. He was 38 years old, compact in build, with receding dark hair and the practiced composure of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. He held a doctorate in philosophy from Columbia University, which he had completed after 7 years of study. He had been a naturalized citizen of the United States for 2 years and a resident of the country for 8. To the CIA employees who processed his contractor paperwork that morning, he was a European intellectual with appropriate credentials, a security clearance freshly granted after background investigation and polygraph examination, and a translator's position in the Directorate of Operations that needed to be filled. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about two people who built 20 years of American lives to destroy them from the inside, and the underground social circuit in Washington that used to do it. To the officers of the Czech Státní bezpečnost, the STB, Czechoslovakia's state security service, who had been planning this moment from a Directorate building in Prague for more than a decade, what happened that autumn morning in Langley was the operation's first completed objective. Everything that had come before had been preparation. Everything that would follow would be collection. Koecher's wife, Hana, was not with him that morning. She was 31 years old, managing a client appointment in New York related to the jewelry business she had been building for 7 years. She knew exactly where her husband was going and exactly what it meant. The two of them had been preparing for this day since before they were married, and its arrival was not a surprise to either of them. It was the end of one operational phase and the beginning of another. What followed from that morning in Langley, the access Karl Koecher gained, the information he passed, the years of intelligence transmitted to Prague, and from there to Moscow, and the human cost of what that intelligence was eventually used for, took 11 years to fully emerge, and in some of its dimensions remains classified to this day. When it did emerge, it would implicate a social scene in Washington that Washington had preferred not to acknowledge, establish a record of one of the most damaging penetrations the CIA sustained during the 1970s, and trace a line of consequence that ended with a man dying alone in a room in Moscow in the spring of 1977 with a poison pen in his hand. Karl František Koecher was born on July 14, 1934, in Czechoslovakia, into a country that was still, at the moment of his birth, the only functioning parliamentary democracy in Central Europe east of the Rhine. He was 13 years old when the country's political character was fixed, first by Nazi occupation beginning in 1939 and then decisively by the Soviet-backed communist coup of February 1948. Old enough to understand what the coup meant, and young enough that the system it installed would be the defining context of his entire education and early adulthood. His father worked in a mid-level administrative capacity in the pre-war civil service. His mother managed the household. The family lived in modest but stable circumstances in a Czechoslovak city that, in the years after February 1948, took on the particular quality common to all Central European cities under communist administration, physically unchanged but psychologically transformed, the same streets and buildings now organized around a different set of permissions and prohibitions. According to court documents filed in connection with the eventual espionage prosecution, Karl was an academically exceptional student from an early age, with a demonstrated aptitude for languages that was unusual, even in a country where multilingualism was relatively common. By the time he completed his secondary education, he was working comfortably in Russian, German, and English in addition to his native Czech and Slovak. He pursued advanced academic study at Czech institutions through the 1950s, moving through an educational system that was simultaneously genuinely rigorous and politically supervised. The State Security Service monitored universities closely during this period, identifying students whose intellectual capabilities, language fluencies, and social self-confidence might eventually make them suitable for foreign intelligence postings. The STB's recruitment approach for this category of potential asset was rarely direct. It proceeded through introductions, through professional conversations, through the gradual accumulation of a relationship with the service that left the individual feeling, by the time any explicit proposal was made, that they had been part of something for longer than they had formally acknowledged. According to later intelligence assessments prepared by both Czech and American services reviewing the Koecher case after his 1984 arrest, he had been recruited as a trained officer of the STB by the early 1960s, not as an informant or a part-time asset, but as a professional being prepared for an operational assignment of unusual duration and ambition. Hana Pařízková was born in 1941, 7 years after Karl, in Czechoslovakia. The specific circumstances of her own recruitment and training within the STB are less completely documented in the available public record than Karl's, but what court proceedings and post-Cold War intelligence assessments establish clearly is that she was a trained officer in her own right, not a spouse brought along for social cover, but a professional with her own assessed capabilities, her own operational role, and her own contribution to an assignment that required two people working in sustained coordination. She and Karl met and married in 1963. In the years between their marriage and their departure for the United States, both underwent a process that intelligence professionals call legend building, the systematic construction of a biographical identity capable of withstanding the scrutiny of Western counterintelligence services that would evaluate any arrival from behind the Iron Curtain claiming to be a political refugee. The legend the STB constructed for the Koechers was considerably more sophisticated than the diplomatic cover under which most Eastern Bloc intelligence officers operated in the United States. Officers working under diplomatic cover could not be arrested or prosecuted, but they operated under constant FBI surveillance, were identified as foreign intelligence personnel from the moment they arrived, and were known quantities to American counterintelligence. What the STB was preparing for Karl and Hana was something of far greater operational value, not diplomatic cover, but the full simulation of genuine defection. They would arrive in the West as people who had left communism because they were opposed to it, who wanted to build lives in a free society, who were motivated by the same values of intellectual and personal freedom that the West claimed to represent. This cover, if it held under scrutiny, would render them essentially invisible to the counterintelligence apparatus designed to monitor declared foreign intelligence officers. The preparation was exhaustive. Karl developed the specific intellectual interests and academic focus, philosophy of language, political theory, the analytical traditions most strongly represented in American and British universities, that would make a Columbia University graduate application both plausible and compelling. He was not manufacturing intellectual credentials he did not possess. The preparation had been built around authentic capabilities, which made it considerably harder to challenge. Hana developed expertise in the gemstone and jewelry trade, an area that required real knowledge, generated real income, and would place her naturally in the social environments of wealthy and professionally connected individuals in any major American city. Both were trained to inhabit their cover identities, not as performances requiring constant maintenance, but as genuine modes of daily living. A cover that felt like a roll would eventually crack under the accumulating weight of years. The preparation, by every later assessment, was thorough. In late 1965, Karl and Hana Koecher arrived in the United States. Their immigration processing followed the standard channels for individuals arriving from communist countries with apparent political motivations. Karl presented himself as a Czechoslovak intellectual who had become disillusioned with the regime and sought intellectual and professional freedom in the West. The CIA and FBI interviewed him, as they interviewed all such arrivals, assessing his account against what they knew about conditions in Czechoslovakia and what the pattern of his life suggested about his motivations. His story held. The preparation had been thorough enough to satisfy everything the 1965 evaluation process was designed to test. Karl enrolled in the philosophy doctoral program at Columbia University in New York City. He and Hana established themselves in a two-bedroom apartment in the Morningside Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, on a block populated by graduate students and junior faculty from the university, precisely the environment where a European doctoral candidate and his professionally active wife would be entirely unremarkable. Karl took the subway south each morning to the Columbia campus, spent his days in seminars and the university library, working on the dissertation that would eventually earn his doctorate, and returned in the evenings to the apartment where Hana would be completing her own day of client meetings and correspondence related to the jewelry business she was developing with steady patience. Their social life was active, genuine, and operationally useful simultaneously. They attended department colloquia and faculty gatherings. They cultivated relationships with the graduate students from a range of departments and with the junior professional faculty who populated New York's intellectual community in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Hana's client base expanded steadily. She developed a reputation in the New York gemstone market as a dealer with real expertise and reliable taste, and her clients were the kind of people who attended charity events, professional dinners, and the social functions through which New York's upper professional community organized itself. Karl's social reputation developed in parallel. Former acquaintances from this period, speaking to journalists and researchers in the years after the espionage case became public, described him consistently as warm, intellectually engaged, and genuinely interesting to be around. He remembered what people had said at previous meetings and followed up on it. He made the people around him feel that their ideas and circumstances mattered to him. They did matter to him in a professional sense that those people had no reason to suspect. He had also, during his years as a student, worked briefly for Radio Free Europe, the American-funded broadcast service that transmitted news and political commentary into Eastern Europe. The employment added a visible and verifiable layer of anti-communist credibility to a biography already being built with precision. A man who had fled Czechoslovakia, completed a doctorate at one of America's most distinguished universities, and found work broadcasting into the Soviet bloc was, to every external appearance, exactly what he claimed to be, an émigré intellectual whose political commitments had been tested and established through years of visible, documented American life. By the time Karl completed his doctorate from Columbia in 1973, the Koechers had spent 8 years building a social and professional foundation in New York that was, by any available measure, genuine. They had also been reporting throughout that entire period, transmitting to their STB handlers through channels their training had provided, not classified information, but the social and professional intelligence that formed the essential substrate of what the operation eventually became, who worked where, which professional circles overlapped with which government agencies, what the texture of opinion was within specific communities of academics and policy professionals, who was connected to whom across the landscape of a city that was, in relevant ways, a map of the American institutional world. In the autumn of 1973, Karl Koecher applied for a contract translator position with the Central Intelligence Agency. The precise circumstances of the application, which professional contacts he used, whether the position was identified through formal channels or through the informal professional networks that had always characterized how the CIA recruited contractors, are not fully established in the public record. What is documented is that he applied, underwent the required vetting process, and was hired. The CIA's vetting procedures for contract employees in 1973 included a background investigation, reviewing employment history, educational credentials, personal references, and financial records, combined with a polygraph examination assessing truthfulness regarding foreign contacts, ideological commitments, and potential security vulnerabilities. According to analyses conducted by FBI and CIA investigators following his 1984 arrest, Koecher passed the polygraph. Intelligence professionals who have addressed this in the post-Cold War period have noted consistently that the instrument, while useful, can be defeated by individuals who have been specifically trained to manage the physiological responses it measures, and that Koecher had undergone professional intelligence training for more than a decade before sitting for the examination. His cover biography by 1973 had accumulated 8 years of verifiable American life, employment records, academic credentials from one of the country's premier universities, naturalized citizenship obtained in 1971, a wife with a legitimate professional business and her own developed social network. The background investigation found what it was designed to find in a genuine Eastern European refugee because the preparation had been designed at precisely this level of institutional scrutiny to be indistinguishable from one. He was assigned to the Directorate of Operations, the CIA's clandestine service, responsible for human intelligence collection, as a translator working on Soviet-related material, and was granted a top-secret clearance with access to sensitive compartmented information. His function was to translate and analyze recordings, intercepted communications, and documents related to the CIA's ongoing source operations inside the Soviet Union. Performing this work competently required more than language fluency. It required operational understanding. A translator reviewing material from an active human intelligence operation needed to comprehend what the material represented, how it fit into the broader architecture of what the agency knew and was trying to learn, and what the specific terms, names, and protocols referenced in the documents actually signified within the context of ongoing operations. The CIA gave Koecher the access that comprehension required. He could read the operational files of Soviet citizens who were passing classified information to the United States. He could see the dead drop sites those operations used, the signal protocols, the communication schedules that coordinated contact between sources and their handlers. He could identify which CIA officers ran the most sensitive Soviet cases and understand the methods those officers used to manage and protect their sources. He could assess what the CIA understood about specific Soviet programs and, by extension, what Soviet counterintelligence needed to protect or could afford to leave exposed. For the Czech intelligence service and the KGB that supervised and directed its operations, Karl Koecher's access was more valuable than almost any other penetration they could have achieved in Washington during this period. He transmitted what he learned. The channels through which he passed information to his STB handlers during his CIA tenure have not been fully disclosed in the public record, but intelligence assessments prepared after his arrest indicate that communication was regular, systematic, and effective. His CIA contract was not renewed after approximately 2 years of service, sometime in 1975. The specific reasoning behind this decision has not been made fully public. Former intelligence officials who have addressed the case have suggested a combination of budget factors and possibly early counterintelligence signals that were not at that stage sufficient to trigger formal investigation. What is certain is that by 1975, Koecher no longer held CIA access. What is equally certain is that whatever he had learned and transmitted during those 2 years had already been received in Prague and forwarded to Moscow long before anyone in a position to act on it understood what had been happening. The operation had not ended. It had transitioned to its next phase. Washington, D.C., in the late 1970s, was a city that contained, within its professional and diplomatic communities, a social landscape considerably more complex than its public institutions acknowledged. Below the level of the diplomatic receptions, policy conferences, and professional associations that constituted the city's visible social life, there existed an extensive network of private gatherings organized around forms of adult social life, whose participants valued, above all else, complete discretion. These networks operated through personal invitation, through unlisted contact information shared exclusively among trusted participants, and through the shared understanding that what occurred at these gatherings was not discussed in professional settings under any circumstances. Their membership included lawyers, federal employees, congressional staffers, military officers, defense contractors, and, according to court documents filed in connection with the Koecher espionage case, a significant number of people employed within American intelligence agencies and the defense establishment. Karl and Hana Koecher were not passive participants in these networks. They were architects of their position within them, and they had identified the Washington social underground not as a personal indulgence, but as an intelligence resource before they had developed the specific relationships within it that would eventually make it productive. Court documents filed in the federal espionage case against Karl Koecher, supplemented by declassified intelligence assessments reviewed by journalists and historians in the decades following his arrest, established the essential structure of what the couple built during the late 1970s and early 1980s. In New York, their attendance at Plato's Retreat, a private social club that operated in Manhattan, beginning in 1977 and drew a membership base drawn from across the city's professional communities, is specifically documented in the court record of the prosecution. In Washington and the surrounding suburbs of Maryland and Virginia, they attended and hosted private gatherings organized through personal referral networks that circulated among professional communities with reasons to value discretion above public visibility. Entry to these gatherings required personal introduction. The shared imperative of absolute privacy was what held the networks together, and it was the same imperative, the fact that participants needed the gatherings to remain entirely unknown, that made them operationally useful to a foreign intelligence service. The social strategy served three intelligence functions that reinforced each other continuously and without apparent seams. The first was identification. These gatherings were populated by definition by individuals who had made a deliberate choice to maintain a significant portion of their private lives in complete separation from their professional identities. These were people with something they needed to conceal, not because their behavior was illegal, but because its public exposure would damage or destroy their careers, their marriages, and the security clearances on which those careers depended. For an intelligence service operating in Washington, this profile described a population of potential leverage, an individual who attended private social gatherings of a sexual nature, who simultaneously held a position requiring classified access, and who was personally known to the Koechers by name, employer, and professional assignment, was a person whose cooperation, if it ever became desirable to pursue, could be encouraged through means that fell well short of explicit coercion. The gatherings provided a systematic way of identifying who among Washington's intelligence and defense communities was in this position in advance of any operational decision about whether or when to approach them. The second function was cultivation. These networks were not isolated events, but ongoing social communities, with recurring participants who developed genuine relationships with one another and with the Koechers across months and years. Karl and Hana were, by every consistent account from the period, skilled at the interpersonal dimensions of this work in ways that operated well below the threshold of anything anyone could have identified as professional manipulation. They were attentive hosts and engaged guests. They remembered what someone had mentioned at a previous gathering, a professional difficulty, a family circumstance, a frustration with a colleague or an institution, and raised it again weeks later in ways that made the person feel genuinely seen. Within these authentic-seeming friendships, the Koechers gathered the kind of professional intelligence that trained collectors use to assess which contacts warrant further development. Employer names, project descriptions, clearance levels, the specific texture of work inside classified programs, described in terms social rather than classified. The third function was direct collection. According to intelligence assessments prepared by FBI and CIA investigators following Koecher's 1984 arrest, at least some of the contacts the Koechers developed through these networks provided intelligence value, not as formal agents who understood themselves to be passing classified material to a foreign power, but as individuals who, in the relaxed social context of relationships they trusted, discussed their professional lives in ways that were useful to a trained collector. An official describing a policy difficulty, a contractor mentioning a technical system not yet publicly acknowledged, an analyst explaining, with the candor that social trust produces, what the intelligence community's current internal assessment of a Soviet capability actually was underneath the hedged language of formal reports. Each such fragment was individually innocuous, assembled across years by professionals who understood precisely how to prompt, how to listen, and how to transmit what they heard. Those fragments constituted a mosaic of considerable value. On the morning of February 6, 1978, a counterintelligence analyst in the Soviet and Eastern European section of the FBI's Washington field office was reviewing a stack of classified assessments that had arrived through secure channels the previous week. The analyst, a woman in her mid-30s, who had been working counterintelligence cases since 1969, and who had developed over nearly 9 years of reviewing background investigation files and surveillance reports, the particular kind of methodical attention to inconsistency that distinguished productive counterintelligence work from routine paperwork, had been assigned to evaluate a specific document her supervisor had flagged for urgent review. The document was a classified assessment prepared by a foreign intelligence partner and transmitted through established liaison channels. It ran to 11 pages and described, in the careful language of a service communicating sensitive information about the source of that information, an operation the partner service believed had successfully penetrated the CIA's Directorate of Operations. The partner service's central analytical conclusion was specific in certain respects. An individual working as a contract translator or analyst in the Directorate of Operations at some point in the early 1970s had provided information about ongoing source operations inside the Soviet Union to Czech intelligence, which had transmitted that information to the KGB. The individual was described as European-born, having entered the United States under academic cover in the mid-1960s, holding advanced academic credentials from an American university, whose contract access to the CIA had ended without formal security action around 1975. The assessment did not provide a name, it provided a profile, and in its final paragraph, in the hedged language of a service that had spent years developing access to Czech intelligence through channels it could not disclose, was a sentence the analyst underlined twice. The partner service assessed with moderate to high confidence that the individual remained in the United States and may have continued to maintain intelligence contacts after his contractor access ended. The analyst carried the document to a bank of 4-drawer metal filing cabinets along the opposite wall of her office. She was looking for background investigation files of former CIA contract employees who matched the assessment's parameters: European-born, academic entry to the United States in the mid-1960s, advanced degree from an American university, contractor access to the Directorate of Operations, clearance terminated without formal adverse action between 1973 and 1976. She pulled the relevant drawer, retrieved a set of hanging folders, and began working through them at the table beside the cabinets. It was 9:17 a.m. There were 11 files that initially met the basic criteria. 7 could be eliminated within the first review. The timing of their access was wrong, or their assigned division within the Directorate did not align with the assessment's description, or their educational background did not fit the profile in ways that were disqualifying. 3 others required careful reading. The 11th file, a folder whose case number she noted at the top of her working list, she set aside after a preliminary review and returned to last. The file concerned a former contractor who had been employed by the CIA in 1973 and 1974 as a translator and analyst in the Directorate of Operations. He was European-born, a naturalized citizen since 1971, and held a doctorate in philosophy from Columbia University. His access to the Directorate had included translation and analysis of material related to Soviet human intelligence source operations. His contract had not been renewed in 1975. There was no formal security action in the file, no derogatory finding, nothing to suggest that anyone at the time of his departure had considered him anything other than a contract employee whose position had ended for administrative reasons. Among the documents in the folder was a photograph from his 1971 naturalization application. It showed a man in his late 30s, slightly built, dark hair beginning to recede, with an expression of composed attention directed at the camera. The analyst reviewed the assessment's profile description again, then looked at the photograph. then looked at the profile again. She checked the dates. She checked the divisional assignment. She noted the doctoral institution and the language specializations. At 9:47 a.m., she wrote a case number at the top of a fresh page of her notepad, wrote the name beneath it, Karl František Koecher, and began drafting the memorandum that would initiate what would eventually become, over the following 7 years, one of the most consequential and legally complex counterintelligence investigations the FBI's Washington field office conducted during the final decade of the Cold War. The investigation that followed the February 1978 identification memo was shaped from its beginning by two constraints that could not be fully resolved simultaneously. The first was the need to accumulate evidence of Koecher's espionage, sufficient to sustain federal prosecution in a courtroom. The second was the near impossibility of accumulating that evidence through the methods that worked most effectively in other espionage cases. Koecher had not used dead drops in the manner of the classic Soviet case officer relationship documented in dozens of previous investigations. He had not passed microfilm packages, had not been observed retrieving chalk marks or hollow trees, had not left physical traces in parks that surveillance teams could document with telephoto cameras from positions across the grass. The information he had passed had moved through social relationships and private conversations, leaving no material evidence that ordinary investigative techniques could capture. The FBI obtained authorization under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed in 1978, the year the Koecher investigation formally opened, for surveillance of both Karl and Hana Koecher, including monitoring of their communications and documentation of their social contacts. Surveillance teams working rotating shifts documented the couple's movements across both New York and Washington throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. They observed the Koechers at social events, documented their travel patterns, identified the professional affiliations of individuals who appeared regularly in their social orbit, and compiled financial records that showed income and expenditure patterns inconsistent with what the Koechers' legitimate professional activities would have produced on their own. By 1983, according to later accounts from former intelligence officials who discussed the case in the post-Cold War period, the FBI's investigative assessment had moved from analytical probability to operational conviction. Karl Koecher was an active STB intelligence officer who had penetrated the CIA's Directorate of Operations, had transmitted information about Soviet source programs during his contractor tenure, and had continued to operate on behalf of Czech intelligence after CIA access ended. The challenge that remained was not establishing what he was, but translating that assessment into a form that could withstand the legal standards of a federal espionage prosecution, particularly given that the foreign intelligence partner whose assessment had initiated the investigation could not be identified publicly, that the signals intelligence contributing to the evidentiary picture could not be disclosed without compromising active collection capabilities, and that the social networks through which Koecher had gathered and transmitted information had been designed, with evident professional care, to leave no observable physical trace. By the autumn of 1984, the FBI had developed information indicating that Karl Koecher was planning international travel in the near term, and that the likely destination, Vienna, was a city that had served throughout the Cold War as one of the primary locations for Eastern Bloc intelligence officers and their assets to conduct face-to-face meetings with handlers beyond the reach of American counterintelligence. A trip to Vienna by an individual the FBI had spent 7 years assessing as an active STB officer at a moment when the investigative record was approaching the threshold of prosecutorial sufficiency, represented a specific and time-sensitive risk. Once Koecher cleared American legal jurisdiction, the prospect of arrest would be foreclosed indefinitely. The decision was made to act. On November 27, 1984, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Karl and Hana Koecher arrived at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York, and proceeded to the Swiss Air departure area for Flight 100 to Zurich, with a connecting service to Vienna. Karl was 50 years old, carrying a bag, moving through the terminal with the unhurried ease of a frequent traveler with nothing on his mind. Hana walked beside him. They had checked in for the flight. According to FBI arrest records filed in connection with the subsequent prosecution, agents assigned to the New York field office had taken positions in the departure area before the Koechers arrived, carrying documentation presenting them as ordinary passengers on the same service. At approximately 3:47 p.m., Karl and Hana Koecher entered the gate area from the main terminal corridor. There was nothing in their bearing, by the accounts of agents observing them as they crossed into the departure area, that indicated awareness that this afternoon differed from any other. The agents moved forward as the Koechers approached the gate. They identified themselves, displayed credentials, and informed Karl František Koecher that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States. Hana was simultaneously detained. According to arrest records, neither showed visible agitation. Karl did not resist. He did not make a statement. The couple was escorted from the departure area through the terminal and out of the building. A carry-on bag was taken into evidence. The Swissair flight departed on schedule. Karl and Hana Koecher were formally charged following their arrest. Karl's charges alleged that he had conspired to communicate national defense information to a foreign government, that material obtained during his CIA contractor employment in 1973 and 1974 had been provided to Czech intelligence and transmitted in turn to Soviet intelligence. Hana was charged with related offenses. Both entered pleas of not guilty. Their attorneys challenged the evidentiary foundation and raised procedural objections to specific aspects of the surveillance through which portions of the evidence had been obtained. The legal case that developed through 1985 presented prosecutors with the tension that appears in virtually every significant counterintelligence prosecution. The most compelling evidence was also the evidence that could not be disclosed in open court without damaging the sources and methods still active in the intelligence community. The foreign intelligence assessment that had first identified Koecher as the probable match to a CIA penetration could not be produced without identifying the partner service that had generated it. The signals intelligence contributing to the investigative picture could not be introduced without revealing collection capabilities the government needed to protect. The surveillance records of the Koechers' social gatherings could be introduced, but the Americans who had attended those gatherings and who could have provided the most direct testimony about what the Koechers had sought to learn from them had personal and professional reasons to prefer not to appear in federal court. Parallel to the criminal proceedings, a diplomatic process had been underway through much of 1985. Anatoly Sharansky, known internationally by his Hebrew name, Natan Sharansky, was a Soviet mathematician and human rights activist who had been imprisoned in the Soviet Union since 1977 on espionage charges that Western governments and human rights organizations regarded as instruments of political persecution rather than legitimate criminal prosecution. His case had been among the most prominent symbols of Soviet treatment of political dissidents throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. He had spent 8 years in Soviet custody, including extended periods in conditions that international observers documented as deliberately punishing. The Soviet government had signaled, through the indirect channels available for such communications, that arrangements for his release might be possible as part of a broader exchange involving Eastern Bloc intelligence officers currently held in Western custody. The Koechers were among the most valuable such individuals the United States possessed. Negotiations conducted through diplomatic intermediaries produced terms both sides found acceptable. On the morning of February 11, 1986, Karl and Hana Koecher were transported to the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the same structure that had served in February 1962 as the exchange point when the United States returned Soviet intelligence officer Rudolf Ivanovich Abel in exchange for American U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers, and that had become in the intervening years the most precise physical symbol in the Cold War landscape of what intelligence work looked like when its human accounting was finally settled. The bridge crossed the Havel River between West Berlin and East Germany. Its center line marked the exact point where one system's legal authority ended and another's began. A group that included Natan Sharansky crossed from east to west that morning. He had been instructed by East German officials to walk forward and not to run. He later described in his memoir deliberately walking in a zigzag pattern as he crossed the white center line into West Berlin, a small, deliberate assertion of personal choice in a transaction that had been decided entirely by others. He crossed into the West. He was free. Karl and Hana Koecher walked in the opposite direction. They crossed from West Berlin into East Germany, into the custody of Czech intelligence, and out of American legal jurisdiction permanently. The full human cost of what Karl Koecher transmitted during his 2 years inside the CIA did not become measurable in any single moment. It accumulated through events that had already occurred before his arrest, in a city on the other side of the Iron Curtain, involving a man whose name Koecher may never have spoken aloud and whose existence he could plausibly have described in any conversation as entirely unknown to him. Aleksandr Dmitrievich Ogorodnik was in his mid-30s in 1973, a Soviet Foreign Ministry official posted in a standard diplomatic capacity to the Soviet Embassy in Bogota, Colombia. He was, by the accounts preserved in post-Cold War intelligence histories, an intelligent and politically aware man whose years of foreign posting had given him a perspective on Soviet life that was difficult to sustain once acquired. He had developed a serious personal relationship with a Colombian woman, a relationship that the rules governing Soviet diplomatic personnel would not permit him to formalize or continue when his posting ended and he returned to Moscow. He understood what he was returning to, and he was weighing that understanding against the terms of a professional and personal life that the Soviet state had, in most essential respects, determined for him. CIA officers operating in Bogota assessed Ogorodnik as a potential recruitment candidate in 1973. Their evaluation of his situation was precise. His personal circumstances had created a psychological opening, and his professional position gave him access to material of operational value to American intelligence. He was approached through methods designed to allow him to withdraw without consequence at any stage. He chose not to withdraw. He agreed to work as a CIA source. He was given the code name TRIGON. Ogorodnik returned to the Soviet Union and eventually obtained a position in Moscow within the Soviet Foreign Ministry's Global Affairs section, an assignment that placed him in access to internal Soviet policy deliberations, senior diplomatic cables, and correspondence among Soviet leadership that was of direct and significant intelligence value to the United States government. The CIA built an operational infrastructure around him designed for the specific constraints of Moscow, a city where KGB surveillance of foreign diplomats and their contacts was systematic, intensive, and technologically sophisticated. Dead drop sites were selected in public locations accessible during ordinary daily routines: parks, specific stretches of pavement, sections of wall near ordinary pedestrian paths, where a person stopping for 30 seconds would appear unremarkable to any observer. The material Ogorodnik transferred was miniaturized, reduced to format small enough to exchange in the time it takes to tie a shoelace, and concealed within objects that would attract no attention. For approximately 4 years, from 1973 until 1977, Aleksandr Ogorodnik provided the CIA with a sustained flow of classified Soviet material. Former CIA officers who have described the Trigon case in post-Cold War accounts, including in the history of the CIA's Cold War Soviet operations published by former officer Milton Bearden, characterized his reporting as among the most valuable human intelligence the agency obtained from a Soviet source during this period. He provided insight into Soviet foreign policy deliberations at levels of internal specificity that other collection methods could not match. The actual Politburo assessments of Western positions in ongoing arms control negotiations, the gap between what Soviet diplomats were authorized to say publicly and what they had been instructed to pursue privately, the internal reasoning behind positions that publicly presented formulations were designed to obscure. In a period when understanding what Soviet leaders actually believed, as distinct from what they were willing to acknowledge believing, was essential to effective American diplomacy and strategic planning, Ogorodnik's access was directly relevant to consequential decisions being made at the highest levels of the American government. The CIA's operational security around Trigon's identity was applied with corresponding seriousness. His reports were distributed under the code name without identifying information that would allow a reader to reconstruct his position or institution. Access to the operational files associated with his handling, the files that would allow a reader to understand not just what TRIGON had reported, but who TRIGON was and how the operation worked, was restricted to a small number of officers with direct need to know. The logic of the restriction was straightforward. A Soviet Foreign Ministry official operating as a CIA source in Moscow, if identified by Soviet counterintelligence, would face a level of consequences that went beyond his own arrest. The KGB's interrogation methods during this period were designed to extract everything an arrested source knew about the CIA's methods, officers, other sources, and communication protocols before the subject died or was allowed to die. Karl Koecher, working as a contractor in the Directorate of Operations from the autumn of 1973 until approximately 1975, translated and analyzed material related to the CIA's Soviet source operations. The damage assessment prepared by CIA and FBI analysts following his 1984 arrest concluded that among the material he had accessed during his contractor tenure was material connected to the TRIGON operation, material whose content, in the hands of a trained intelligence officer reporting systematically to Czech and Soviet services, would have provided the KGB with significant elements of what a counterintelligence operation requires to identify and locate an active source in a Soviet government ministry. In the spring of 1977, the KGB arrested Aleksandr Ogorodnik. Soviet counterintelligence confronted him with evidence of what he had been doing, evidence that was, by the accounts of former CIA officers who have described this period, specific and detailed in ways that indicated prior knowledge rather than inference from standard surveillance. The KGB knew, or appeared to know, with a specificity that could not be explained by routine investigation. During the initial interrogation session, Ogorodnik asked to be provided a pen to write a statement. The request appeared routine and was accommodated. The pen was a device the CIA had provided to him as a standard component of his operational security equipment, an object that contained, in addition to its writing function, a small capsule of a fast-acting chemical compound intended as a final option if capture became unavoidable. Ogorodnik broke the capsule and swallowed its contents. He died within minutes of his arrest in the presence of his KGB interrogators, before they had extracted whatever information they had expected his interrogation to produce. The CIA officers who had run the TRIGON operation and who later addressed its loss in post-Cold War accounts described Ogorodnik's death in terms that resist the clinical language of operational assessment. He had been a person they had recruited, developed, protected, or believed they were protecting, through years of careful operational security. His death was not a setback in the neutral language of intelligence evaluation. It was the death of a specific man who had trusted a relationship and an organization with his life, and who had died in the manner he died because that relationship had, somewhere along the chain from his identity to the KGB's knowledge of it, failed him. The CIA officers who ran him did not know in the spring of 1977 where the failure had originated. The investigation that produced that knowledge took 7 more years. The identification of Karl Koecher as the probable source of TRIGON's exposure is not a conclusion the CIA or FBI has made formally and definitively public. The damage assessment that addressed the question is classified. Former intelligence officials who have discussed the Koecher case in the post-Cold War period have described the connection as a strong analytical probability rather than a proven fact, grounded in the specificity of Koecher's access, the specificity of what the KGB appeared to know about the operation, and the absence of any comparably positioned access vector that investigators identified during the damage assessment. Koecher himself has not confirmed or denied this dimension of his espionage in his public statements. He has not addressed it. What the documentary record establishes without ambiguity is the sequence. Koecher had access to TRIGON-related material during his CIA tenure in 1973 and 1974. Ogorodnik was arrested and died in 1977. The The damage assessment conducted after Koecher's 1984 arrest identified Soviet source programs compromised during his contractor period. The former CIA officers who have described their experience of learning what Koecher had done have done so in terms that reflect an understanding of specific losses, specific sources, specific programs, specific consequences, whose full disclosure remains restricted. Aleksandr Ogorodnik was in his late 30s when he died. His name did not appear in newspapers. His connection to the Koecher case was not made public when Koecher was arrested in 1984. He entered the available historical record gradually through the work of intelligence historians and through the accounts of former officers who became willing to speak carefully about what had occurred as the Cold War's institutional secrecy slowly loosened after 1991. He appears in those accounts as a consequence, specific, human, and irreversible, of an intelligence operation whose most visible participants all survived it, and several of whom were professionally celebrated for what they had accomplished. Karl and Hana Koecher returned to Czechoslovakia in February 1986 and were received by Czech intelligence as professionals who had executed an ambitious and consequential assignment. Portions of the Czech State Security Archive became accessible to researchers after the Velvet Revolution of November 1989 brought democratic government to Czechoslovakia and initiated the process of opening the state security apparatus's records to historical examination. What researchers working in those archives have found confirms, in the documents available for review, what American intelligence assessments had concluded from the damage side. The operation was regarded within the STB as a significant achievement, and Karl Koecher was recognized accordingly. The country they returned to in 1986 did not exist in that form for long. The STB, the service they had spent their professional lives working for, was formally dissolved in January 1990. Its files, hundreds of thousands of folders documenting 4 decades of surveillance operations, recruitment campaigns, foreign intelligence activities, and the systematic monitoring of Czechoslovak citizens, were transferred to a new institution established to hold and provide access to the archive. Czech citizens whose lives had been documented by the service, and researchers studying what the service had done, began the process of examining a record that was by turns bureaucratic, revealing, and deeply uncomfortable. The Soviet Union, whose intelligence apparatus had been the ultimate beneficiary of the Koecher operation, dissolved in December 1991. Karl Koecher has given periodic interviews to journalists and researchers in the decades since his return to what became, after 1993, the Czech Republic. His statements have been consistently selective. He has acknowledged in general terms that the operation accomplished its objectives. He has declined to confirm specific intelligence transmitted, citing obligations to a service that no longer formally exists. He has spoken about the CIA work in the language of professional tradecraft, the vocabulary of mission and method, rather than in terms of what specific individuals were harmed by the information he provided and how. He has not, in any interview available in the public record, addressed by name the question of Aleksandr Ogorodnik. When interviewers have raised the broader question of whether the operation's intelligence product caused harm to individuals, his responses have been careful, acknowledging the general proposition that intelligence operations have human consequences while declining to engage with the specific accounting of what those consequences were. Hana Koecher has been substantially more private since their return. She has not given interviews of comparable scope and has maintained a life outside the public record of the case and its aftermath. The CIA's post-arrest damage assessment remains largely classified. Former intelligence officials who have discussed it publicly describe its findings as significant in scope, that the range of programs and source relationships potentially compromised during Koecher's access period was broad enough to require modification or termination of multiple ongoing operations, and that some of those decisions were made specifically because the uncertainty about what Koecher had been able to access and transmit made continued operation without full confidence in source security untenable. the specific programs, the specific sources, the specific operational consequences of what Koecher passed. These have not been made public and may not be for years. The colleagues who worked alongside Karl Koecher during his 2 years as a CIA contractor, the analysts and translators and operations officers who shared the building, attended the same briefings, exchanged the ordinary professional courtesies of people doing serious classified work together, received no private notification when the 1984 arrest was made public beyond what appeared in press reporting. Former CIA employees from that period who spoke to journalists and historians in subsequent decades described their experience of his arrest with a quality that recurs consistently across their accounts. Not anger, not fear that their own work had been compromised, but the particular unease of reviewing a period of apparently ordinary professional life with full knowledge of what had actually been occurring within it. They did not remember anything from 1973 or 1974 that, in retrospect, should have alerted them. This is not a defense of the CIA's vetting procedures in 1973, which were insufficient for the specific category of penetration Koecher represented. It is a description of how well the preparation worked. The Americans who attended the Koecher's social gatherings in Washington and New York over the years, who liked them as companions and spoke with them about their professional lives with the ordinary candor that social trust produces, were not named in the public proceedings of the espionage case. Their involvement was a matter for counterintelligence assessment, rather than criminal prosecution, since attending a private social gathering and speaking honestly to the people, there is not a crime. That the people they were speaking honestly to were trained intelligence officers whose professional function was to collect everything those conversations produced was something that could not have been discovered from any external examination of the social environment, because the environment had been built to prevent exactly that discovery. The security reforms implemented by the CIA following the Koecher arrest addressed specific procedural vulnerabilities, enhanced polygraph protocols for contractors with access above certain classification thresholds, more rigorous foreign contact reporting requirements, expanded scrutiny of behavioral and financial patterns for employees assigned to the Directorate of Operations' most sensitive programs. Former intelligence officials who participated in the post-arrest reviews have been consistent in noting that the procedural reforms address symptoms rather than the underlying structural condition. The asymmetry between the preparation of a trained patient intelligence officer operating under deep cover built over more than a decade and the background investigation the CIA conducts for a contractor position is not a gap that polygraph protocols and reporting requirements can fully close. The preparation, when it is done as thoroughly as Koecher's was done, is designed specifically to be indistinguishable from the real thing at every level of scrutiny the hiring institution applies. The Koecher case occurred in a period that intelligence historians have characterized as among the most damaging for American intelligence security during the Cold War's final decade. The Walker family spy ring, which had compromised American naval communications for nearly 2 decades, was exposed in 1985, 1 year after Koecher's arrest. The identification of CIA officer Aldrich Ames as a KGB source, a penetration that had been active since 1985, came in 1994. The identification of FBI agent Robert Hansen as a Soviet, and then Russian intelligence asset, a penetration active since 1979, came in 2001. The pattern these cases collectively trace, deeply embedded human penetrations by trained officers specifically prepared to defeat the institutional vetting processes designed to identify them, is one that American counterintelligence has addressed through sustained reform and has not fully solved. Karl Koecher was 31 years old when he and Hana arrived in the United States in 1965. He was 38 when he drove down the George Washington Memorial Parkway and received his first contractor's badge in Langley. He was 50 when FBI agents moved toward him at a departure gate at JFK Airport. He was 51 when he walked across the Glienicke Bridge into East Germany and out of American legal reach for the last time. He is in his late 80s now, living in the Czech Republic, in a country whose existence was enabled by the collapse of the system he served. The questions his case raises are ones that intelligence histories address in institutional terms, because those are the terms in which institutional responses are designed. What failed in the 1973 vetting process? What surveillance methods should have been deployed earlier? What legal frameworks were insufficient? These questions deserve serious answers and have received serious institutional attention in the decades since. But they are not the only questions the case raises, and they are not the hardest ones. The question that sits apart from the institutional analysis concerns Aleksandr Ogorodnik, the question of what it means that a man trusted the CIA's protection of his identity and died in a KGB interrogation room because that protection had a vulnerability in it that neither he nor the officers who ran him knew was there. He had taken a risk he judged acceptable. He had maintained it for 4 years inside one of the most surveilled environments on Earth. He had died not because his own tradecraft had failed, but because information about him had traveled through a channel he did not know existed. The former CIA officers who have addressed his case describe the loss in terms that are carefully measured and that, in their carefulness, convey the weight of what they are not fully saying. They speak of what it means to lose a source. They speak of what the operation's failure meant for the broader program. They do not speak in available accounts about what it meant for Aleksandr Ogorodnik specifically, because what it meant for him is not something that can be adequately addressed within the professional language available to former intelligence officers speaking about former operations. The question of what Karl Koecher understood about the consequences of what he transmitted is one he has declined to answer directly in any of his public statements. He has acknowledged success. He has declined to examine cost. These are, from a professional standpoint, consistent positions for a trained intelligence officer to maintain. He was not in the business of evaluating the human consequences of what his service did with the intelligence he provided, only of providing it as effectively as possible. Whether this professional consistency reflects genuine indifference to what his transmission of Ogorodnik-related material may have produced, or a form of deliberate non-engagement with a question he prefers not to answer, his public record does not establish. Natan Sharansky, who crossed the Glienicke Bridge in the opposite direction from the Koechers on the morning of February 11th, 1986, and who walked in a deliberate zigzag because it was the only form of self-determination available to him in a moment, scripted entirely by others, built a public life after his release that has been shaped by everything his 9 years in Soviet custody did and did not take from him. He has written and spoken and argued and engaged with the world in ways that are, in their sustained public presence, the opposite of what the Koechers have represented since their return to Prague. Whether the human cost of the exchange that freed him, the freedom given to two people whose operation had helped ensure that a Soviet source died in custody, is something he has had occasion to reflect on, is not something the available record establishes. The photograph in the FBI's arrest documentation file taken at JFK Airport on the afternoon of November 27, 1984, shows a compact man with thinning gray hair being escorted through a terminal. He appears unremarkable, slightly past middle age, carrying a bag, moving through an ordinary American airport on an ordinary American afternoon. There is nothing in the image that suggests what he had built across 20 years, or what he had done with what he built, or what had been lost because of it. There is nothing in the image that suggests Aleksandr Ogorodnik, or the spring of 1977, or a room in Moscow, or a pen. This is, in retrospect, precisely the point. The operation worked for as long as it did because Karl Koecher had spent more than a decade learning to look, in every photograph and every interaction and every institutional evaluation, exactly like what he was not.